So in this segment, I want to discuss the case for reforming council tax and potentially Labour discussing a land tax, which I really doubt they'll implement. But just talking about the housing situation in general. So this from the IFS and Dan Needle.
Let's talk about the disaster that is the current taxation system for housing and what we should do to sort that out. Because you could, one of the things Rachel Reeves will also be thinking about, or she will be asking her officials, is what can you do to the tax system to improve economic efficiency and growth? One answer to that is, just start the taxation of housing all over again. But Dan, you wanted to come in on this.
Let's say, as you probably do, Paul, you live in a £100 million penthouse.
Oh, absolutely.
In the West End. How much council tax do you pay on that? £1,946.32. Let's say that I live in a house in Blackpool that is a terraced house. It's an exactly average house in Blackpool. How much council tax do I pay? £2,783. A terraced house in Blackpool pays significantly more council tax than a £100 million penthouse in the West End.
So this could be done for a few different reasons. The council tax system in the UK is really broken. One of the things councils are disincentivised to do is to increase council taxes as well, because that will guarantee them they lose votes. So I think that's why it's got to be a government decision to really change the way the bans work and things like that, because you can't be in a situation where someone living in a very modest house is paying way more council tax than someone living in a penthouse. And speaking of kind of the unfairness of the system, this is Grace Blakely discussing this as well.
Just think about the astonishing intergenerational unfairness that is the UK housing market.
Council tax and the way it's calculated is so outdated because it's based on valuations from back in the 1990s. I think everyone pretty much agrees it doesn't work, don't they?
Yeah, I think you're right. I think this is one of those taxes that everyone is like, this needs reform, this needs to be changed. Now, people are pretty put off trying to change it based on the fact that the last person who tried to do a big transformation in council tax was, of course, Margaret Thatcher with the poll tax, and that basically ended her political career. But everyone agrees that it's completely broken.
And, seeing as Labour are determined to keep talking about tough choices, I guess this is one of the ones that they'll have to take.
So I
wish they would take.
Actually think that this proposal that we're now hearing about from Labour is kind of being muttered about and being leaked, that they might introduce a 0.5% tax on the value of the property per year, basically.
We've just done some sums on that, haven't we? So if you've got like a 350 grand house, that would be £1,750 a year. Now, that doesn't sound too dissimilar for what you would pay in council tax already for that kind of house. However, if your house is worth £2 million, that is 10 grand a year. And there'll be people listening to this who are suddenly, oh my God, that could be us. There'll be other people going, this is great, because that feels much fairer. What do you think?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of really good arguments for this, and then there are some things that will need to be managed, right? So some really good arguments for it. Firstly, lots of people who are very, very wealthy have lots of very effective, often completely legal ways of avoiding tax. And it's easy to do that when you're able to shift the kind of income that you have from, different places. Say it's coming from a limited company rather than your income, whatever. Put it in different trusts or, all sorts of different ways.
Change your status to non-dom and things like that. What I'd say is, I think it's a good idea to do it on property. I think you will get issues around if their property is based in London or the south of England, because those properties are much higher. And also, what about people who own multiple properties? Would they get away with it because they could own, multiple properties worth, £200,000, for example? So I think it should be based on the total amount of assets you own as well, rather than just one property. You can set the base rate at, 600k or something like that. That's how I would want to have it done, potentially.
You can kind of legally avoid tax. This is much, much harder to avoid. And we know that tax avoidance is a really big problem at the upper end of the income spectrum. So it does cut into that problem of tax avoidance and evasion, particularly because there are a lot of people as well who just stick money in property. There's actually a big problem of people laundering money through London property. And we, saw this with Russian money laundering in the wake of the war in Ukraine as well. This suddenly became a political hot button when actually it's been a problem for a really long time. And crucially, there's lots of arguments about an old person living in a very valuable house, and that would be really unfair. Let's just think about the astonishing intergenerational unfairness that is the UK housing market. If you bought a house before the bubble in the 1970s, you could have bought a house for like 10 grand that's now worth several £100,000. You've done absolutely nothing to earn that increase. It's all been because we had this massive boom in international financial markets, tons of money being pumped into the housing market. And then more recently, the creation of lots more money through central bank money creation that has, again, artificially boosted.
Also, the fact that the UK hasn't built enough houses as well means that because there's a massive lack of supply, your house value goes up. This is not like people who bought, Apple stocks back in the 2000s. These are people who just bought a house. Or maybe a few houses way back then when it was significantly cheaper, when the ratio from income to house house costs was much lower. So it is genuinely unfair that the way the housing bubble has gone, and society will always be unfair for people to an extent. It's just a question of how unfair is it for certain types of people, because if they do a land tax like this, it will impact people who may have bought houses in the last century or the start of the 2000s, whose houses are massively appreciated, and they'll be potentially facing a tax. But at the same time, if the government used that money, if they did a potential property tax and use that money to build new homes, sustainable housing, council housing, for example, that would be phenomenal. That would be a way to help rebalance the system. Not saying Labour would use the money for that. They're too stupid to do something like that. But the system is fundamentally flawed, and there has to be big changes in order to kind of rebalance the housing market.
Financial markets and housing markets. It's so unfair. And then if you didn't manage to get on that bandwagon at the right time, you're left with the wreckage of a housing crisis, which means that you can't afford to purchase a house because the average house is worth so much more than the average income, and it's very hard to get a mortgage and all this different sorts of stuff. So there is this fundamental intergenerational unfairness, and also a fundamental unfairness of the fact that this is wealth that has been accrued not based on hard work and effort, but basically just based on a big international housing bubble, and also the action of governments that worked to make it even bigger than it otherwise might have been.
Yeah, and just basic geography as well. And I agree with that. They didn't make a bold decision at some point. Knowing their investment pay off, they didn't work really hard for it. It just happened because a massive lack of supply, and that their house is in a more desirable area of the country. So there has to be massive things done to rebalance the housing situation in the UK. I just don't know if I can't imagine Labour will do this, to be honest with you. A 0.5% kind of property tax or land tax on houses worth say over say 300,000. I can't imagine they're going to do it. The Labour Party are terrified of the tabloid press, and they would absolutely run with this one. But just speaking of the ideas alone, let me know what you think of them in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, support the channel on Patreon if you can, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.